Chapter 11. River watched from the shadows, a peculiar mix of pride and growing unease swirling within him. Pride in the music and the profound connection his anonymous art forged with millions. Unease at the sheer intensity of the hunt. He was creating something beautiful, something powerful, but it was attracting a hungry beast, a public that demanded to consume the artist, not just the art. River Hayes, the medical intern haunted by a past he couldn't escape, the man still navigating the painful realities of a divorce and a devastating loss, was becoming a global enigma. The pressure was beginning to tell. The whispers of fame, once a distant hum, were now a rising crescendo, threatening to overwhelm the fragile peace he desperately clung to. The misidentification, initially a bizarre form of protection, began to fray. As the Velvet Mask's fame intensified, so did the scrutiny, twisting from harmless speculation into a relentless targeted hunt. The "don't I know you" moments, once infrequent and easily dismissed, became increasingly frequent, more pointed, more unsettling. It started subtly. In the hospital cafeteria, a nurse sipping her coffee would squint at him. "You know, Dr. Hayes, you remind me of someone. That one director everyone thinks is the Velvet Mask. It's the eyes, maybe, or the way you carry yourself." River would offer a polite, non-committal smile, his heart doing a frantic tap dance against his ribs. "Oh, really? I get that a lot," he'd lie, his voice even, his facade uncracked. But the encounters grew bolder, more direct. Walking down a street in West Los Angeles, a fan of the Velvet Mask, or rather the person they thought was the Velvet Mask, would approach him. "Excuse me, are you right?" They'd begin, their eyes narrowing, searching his face, trying to reconcile his obscure features with the image of the famous director or musician. River would shake his head, offer a quick "sorry, wrong guy," and quickly walk away, his pace accelerating, his paranoia mounting. The pervasive use of masks due to lingering public health concerns only intensified the irony and his fear. While everyone else wore masks for protection, this felt like a deliberate act of concealment, making him a suspicious figure, drawing unwanted attention. The fact that he often wore a hat low over his eyes and chose dark, unassuming clothing only amplified the mystery for those already searching. He was becoming a phantom in his own life, forced to hide in plain sight. Online, the debate raged. While the majority still fixated on the wrong famous figures, a new, more dangerous theory began to emerge in niche forums. What if the Velvet Mask isn't famous at all? What if he's just a regular person? This was a truly terrifying thought, the one that made River's blood run cold. They weren't just chasing the wrong celebrity. They were starting to chase an unknown, a civilian, someone who desperately wanted to remain hidden. The cracks in his carefully constructed facade were widening, threatening to expose the raw, vulnerable man beneath. His life, a meticulous balance of hidden identities, was teetering on the brink of collapse. The digital hunt for the Velvet Mask intensified, evolving from playful speculation into a relentless, almost predatory pursuit. News articles, once content with broad theories, now published deep dives into the mystery man's habits, his rumored hangouts, even analyzing subtle vocal nuances in his songs for clues to his regional origin. While they were still largely chasing the wrong famous leads, the sheer volume of their scrutiny was terrifying. Social media became a minefield. Unmask the Velvet Mask hashtags trended, alongside detailed fan analyses of his body language and grainy, distant concert footage. People cross-referenced guest lists at music industry events with lists of known recluses. Investigative journalists, sensing a lucrative story, began staking out recording studios known to be associated with his producers. River felt the digital net tightening. Every mundane errand became an exercise in hypervigilance. He stopped visiting Charlie's, afraid of drawing unwanted attention to the one place he truly felt free. His calls with Kate, once a source of pure comfort, now contained a subtle undercurrent of anxiety. He would sometimes hear her voice, a gentle question, "Are you okay, River? You seem on edge." He'd dismiss it, blaming long hospital hours, the stress of his boards. But the truth was, the pressure of being hunted was crushing him. His fears spiraled, feeding off each other. He worried about Elias Vance, about the contract. Would the agency eventually demand he reveal himself, especially if the pressure from the public became too great? Would they try to orchestrate a reveal without his consent? He also worried about his past, River Hayes' fragile privacy. His biological family, especially Regan, would undoubtedly seize on his. He could almost hear her voice, ringing with false pride, demanding access, demanding money. leveraging her famous son to gain status. Frankie would inevitably find new investment opportunities, and Ralph's jealousy would fester into something even more dangerous. His anonymity was no longer about privacy, it was about survival. It was about protecting the delicate balance of his life, about shielding the few people he loved from the toxic chaos that surrounded him. He knew with chilling certainty that the public, the media, they didn't care about the art. They cared about the spectacle, about the unmasking, about owning a piece of the mystery. He was terrified of being consumed, of being reduced to a headline, his very soul laid bare for public consumption and judgment. The digital hunt was closing in, and he felt utterly, terrifyingly exposed. River's life became a constant exercise in evasion, a meticulous choreography of concealment. Sprawling anonymity of Los Angeles, once a refuge, now felt like a vast, hostile landscape where every shadow held a potential threat. He moved through his days hyper-vigilantly, his senses heightened, constantly scanning his surroundings. His routine became rigid, almost obsessive. He woke before dawn, slipping out of his apartment to avoid any potential loiterers or curious neighbors. He took circuitous routes to the hospital, varying his path daily, constantly checking his rearview mirror. He wore a uniform of anonymity, dark, unassuming clothes, a baseball cap pulled low, and his ever-present medical-grade mask. Even when mandates had lessened, he had adopted a slight slouch, a way of minimizing his height and distinctive posture. He walked with purpose, never lingering, never drawing attention. The hospital, once a sanctuary, became another place he had to perform. He perfected the art of the quick glance, the neutral expression, the polite but unengaging conversation. He made sure his voice when he spoke was always in his cultivated, neutral American accent, devoid of any European lilt that might betray his Berlin past. He tried to avoid long interactions, to remain just another busy intern, blending into the white coats and hurried footsteps. "Every don't I know you," or lingering stare from a patient or colleague sent a jolt of ice through his veins. He imagined them connecting his blue eyes, visible above his mask, to the velvet mask billboards, then trying to link that to the infamous director or jazz musician. He knew it was only a matter of time before someone, somewhere, made the true connection. His paranoia bled into every aspect of his life. He stopped using his credit cards for anything non-essential, preferring cash. He avoided public places, no longer going to restaurants or cafes, fearing a stray photo, casual encounter. His runs, once a release, became tense, hurried affairs, his eyes constantly darting, his body coiled, ready to flee. He even started pulling his curtains shut all day, living in the dim, perpetual twilight of his apartment, convinced that unseen eyes might be watching. Exhaustion was bone deep, a constant ache that permeated every muscle, every thought. He was running on fumes, his sleep still fragmented by nightmares, now increasingly populated by faceless crowds and snapping camera lenses. The stress manifested physically. The tremor in his hands was more pronounced, a constant, subtle vibration that made even simple tasks difficult. His appetite waned, his body thinning, strung taut like a guitar string pulled to breaking point. He was living in the shadows, a prisoner of his own success, haunted by the fear of exposure. The privacy he had fought so hard for, the anonymity he had meticulously cultivated, slowly, agonizingly, being stripped away, leaving him utterly vulnerable. The omnipresent fear of exposure had become a tangible weight on River's shoulders, a suffocating burden that felt heavier than any medical textbook or surgical instrument. It was a fear woven from multiple threads, each one a razor-sharp wire threatening to sever his already fragile peace. At the forefront was the threat to his medical career. He had fought tooth and nail to get back into medical school, to fulfill Vera's dying wish, to prove his own worth after the catastrophic derailment of his addiction. He was an intern, still proving himself, still vulnerable. A scandal, a public reveal of his secret life as the Velvet Mask, particularly one involving a divorce and past struggles with substance abuse, would undoubtedly jeopardize his future. He pictured the scorn in the eyes of his professors, the disappointment of Dr. Albright, the endless ethical debates in his program. He would be seen as frivolous, irresponsible, perhaps even unstable. The very foundation of his hard-won stability would crumble. Then there was Lakin. He knew she still hadn't accepted the finality of the divorce, not emotionally, even if the papers were signed. She was a woman, driven by status and avarice. A public unmasking of the Velvet Mask as River Hayes would be a goldmine for her. He could almost hear her calculating laugh. picturing her basking in the media spotlight, twisting his fame into a narrative of her victimhood, demanding a larger financial settlement for her suffering. Her lawyers, far more aggressive than his own, would descend like vultures. The privacy he cherished, the financial independence he'd fought for, would be utterly consumed by her greed. He had seen the cold calculation in her eyes, the way she used people, and he knew he would be her ultimate trophy. And the deepest, coldest fear, his biological family, Reagan, Frankie, Ralph, they were the original architects of his trauma, the ones who had consistently exploited him, the ones who had made him feel fundamentally unworthy, disposable. He pictured Reagan's eyes, not with love, but with a cold, predatory gleam, seeing his fame as a new wellspring of resources to drain. He could hear her voice, ringing with false pride, demanding access, demanding money, leveraging her famous son to gain social status and financial comfort. Frankie would inevitably find new investment opportunities, ludicrous business schemes that he would be pressured publicly to fund. Ralph, his jealousy already a venomous force, would likely become even more volatile, demanding a cut of the pie, perhaps even seeking public validation of his connection to the global star. The sheer thought of their toxic presence, amplified by the relentless glare of the media spotlight, made his blood run cold. They had always managed to find a way to reinsert themselves, to inflict fresh wounds. His anonymity was his last desperate defense against their relentless pursuit, their attempts to strip him of his very self. He was terrified of being consumed, of being reduced to a headline, his very soul laid bare for public consumption and judgment, particularly by the people who had first taught him the meaning of abandonment. The weight of those fears clung to him, suffocating him. He was losing control, losing his grip on the precarious balance of his life. The anonymous fame of the Velvet Mask, once a glorious escape, was becoming a terrifying, monstrous entity, threatening to devour everything he had fought so hard to protect. The studio, once River's sacred sanctuary, had slowly transformed into a gilded cage. The recording sessions, once exhilarating outpourings of raw emotion, now felt fraught with anxiety. Every melody, every lyric was meticulously scrutinized, not for artistic merit, but for any subtle clue that might betray his identity. He became self-conscious, editing himself, pulling back from the raw vulnerability that had defined his music, fearing he might accidentally reveal too much. The joy began to drain from the process. The intense satisfaction he once felt in pouring his soul into a track, in crafting a profound confession in anonymity, was replaced by a gnawing fear of exposure. He still recorded, driven by Elias Vance's relentless demands and the momentum of his fame, but the creative flow became sluggish, hesitant. His lyrics, once deeply personal, now felt more guarded, cloaked in layers of abstraction, lest a too specific detail betray him. He spent less time in his home studio. The platinum plaques on the walls, symbols of his global success, seemed to mock him, gleaming with a fame he couldn't publicly claim, a triumph he couldn't truly celebrate. The very act of creating music, once his lifeline, his escape from the mundane misery of his life, had become a source of profound stress. The silence when he didn't pick up his guitar or turn on the mixing board was deafening. He missed the catharsis, the pure, unadulterated release. He missed the feeling of losing himself in the melody, of becoming just the voice, unbound by the pressures of his life as River Hayes. He missed the way music could temporarily silence the voices of his past, nagging fear of unworthiness. He began to actively reduce his music output, a desperate, almost suicidal act for an artist of his caliber. He told Elias Vance he needed a creative break, citing exhaustion and the demands of his ongoing medical studies. Vance was furious, reminding him of contractual obligations, of the unprecedented momentum of the Velvet Mask. But River was resolute. He knew that if he continued at this pace, under this level of scrutiny, it was only a matter of time before someone, somewhere, made the connection, before a careless slip destroyed everything. He believed in his desperate heart that stopping the music, pulling back from the public eye, was the only way to protect his privacy, to protect his identity, and, ironically, to protect his very sanity. The thought of his biological family descending like vultures on his fame, of Lakin leveraging it for financial gain, was a torment he could no longer bear. So, he made the agonizing decision to silence his muse, to abandon the very thing that made him feel alive, believing it was the only way to safeguard what little he had left. The studio, once a sanctuary, was now a tomb for his creative soul, a testament to the crushing weight of fame and fear. His calls with Kate, once the purest source of solace in his life, now carried a subtle, almost imperceptible undercurrent of anxiety. River still looked forward to them with a desperate longing clinging to her voice, her unwavering empathy, her quiet understanding. They were his lifeline, his only true connection in a world that felt increasingly isolated. But the fear of exposure, the constant tightening of the digital noose around the velvet mask, made him more guarded, more cautious, even with her. He longed to tell her everything, to confess the colossal secret of the velvet mask, to finally unburden himself of the fame he couldn't claim, the identity he had to protect. He yearned to tell her how much her understanding, her quiet wisdom, had fueled his creative output, and how her strength had inspired his most profound songs. He wanted to confess the irony, that the faceless artist was him, the very man she had touched, the very man who still loved her. He wanted to explain the depth of his fear, the constant threat of being hunted, the paranoia that shadowed his every waking moment. But the risk felt too great. If he told Kate, he risked her inadvertently revealing something, however small, however innocent, that could connect River Hayes to the velvet mask. He knew Kate had a pure heart, a naive trust in people, evident in her struggle to see Ireland's true malice. He couldn't risk her genuine concern turning into suspicion, or worse, her being manipulated by Ireland again, inadvertently exposing him. The thought of his identity being revealed through a leak, however accidental, was a nightmare he couldn't. So, he continued to hold back, a heavy cloak of secrecy draped over his musical life. He spoke of his exhaustion from his internship, the constant grind of hospital life, the complexities of his divorce, his grief for Vera. Kate listened, her soft hums of understanding a constant comfort. She shared more about her own life, her boys, her art, her challenges as a single mother. She spoke of her continued confusion over Ireland's behavior, sometimes expressing frustration at Ireland's veiled remarks or subtle attempts to sow discord. Though she still hadn't fully grasped the depth of Ireland's calculated malice, River would offer vague warnings, hinting at Ireland's untrustworthiness, urging Kate to be cautious. But he never dared to elaborate, never dared to paint the full, horrifying picture of Ireland's villainy. The emotional intimacy between them deepened, even with this massive secret hanging between them. They spoke of the fear of vulnerability, of the struggle to trust, of the constant battle against past trauma. He learned more about her disassociation, how it stemmed from her early life, her parents' distant unhappiness, her struggle to feel truly present. He confessed his own battles with unworthiness, how it had driven his addiction, his need to numb himself, his compulsion to run. Kate, in turn, offered compassion and acceptance, making him feel, for the first time, not broken, but simply human. The silence between rings was shorter than usual. River answered before the third buzz, his voice low and gravel-edged. "Hey." Kate smiled at the sound. "Hey yourself, you sound tired." "Long shift," he said. It was true, just not the full truth. She could picture him, sitting on the edge of his bed, or maybe the floor, lights off, curtains drawn, the way he always seemed to live these days, in shadow. "How's the chaos?" she asked gently. "Hospitals, I mean. Are they still swallowing you whole?" "Pretty much," he replied with a small laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. "But I'm keeping my head above water, barely. Just enough to breathe, just enough to make it seem like he wasn't slipping under." Kate let the pause stretch, listening to the faint static on the line. There was a distance in his voice tonight, not just physical, emotional. He'd been like that more lately, like he was already halfway gone, even when he called. "You've been quiet lately," she said. "Quieter than usual, I mean." "Yeah, sorry. Another beat. Just a lot on my mind." "You want to talk about it?" He hesitated. She could hear it, the way he almost did, the words forming somewhere behind his ribs, pressed hard against his throat. But they never came. "It's nothing serious," he said finally, gently. "Just work. And life." Kate didn't push, she never did. But tonight she couldn't stop herself entirely. "You're not disappearing on me, are you?" River closed his eyes, resting his head against the wall. "No." It came out too quickly, too practiced. "Of course not." She gave a soft laugh, not unkind. "Okay." Then more quietly, Sometimes it feels like you're preparing to vanish, like you're saying goodbye without saying it." He wanted to tell her then, about the move, about how his application had gone through, about the way everything was shifting beneath his feet again. But the words tasted like betrayal. He couldn't bring himself to break the peace of her voice with the chaos of his reality. "I'm still here, Kate," he said instead. "Good," she replied, but something in her voice was already dimmed. Because I don't think I could take another goodbye right now. His voice was soft, tired, but lighter than it had been in weeks. She could hear wind in the background, maybe from his cracked window, the familiar hum of law blurring behind him. Are you driving? She asked. Park. Pause. Just couldn't sleep. Mine won't shut off. I know the feeling, she said. Then, after a moment, nervous? He gave a quiet exhale, almost a laugh. Yeah, Edinburgh feels real now. Flights are booked. Paperwork's processed. Kate blinked. You didn't tell me that. Didn't want to make it a thing. He paused. I'm not going for the job. I'm going for you. She didn't speak right away. Her fingers still on the page. River, I need to do this, Kate. His voice was steady now. LA was never the destination. It was survival. But you, Scotland, you feel like something else, something worth choosing. She felt it then, deep in her chest, that ache of possibility, of walls coming down after years of only holding them up. No grand gestures, just the quiet miracle of someone showing up. You know it rains here constantly, right? She teased gently, blinking fast. Yeah, I figured. He smiled through the line. I'll bring waterproof shoes and unresolved trauma. Kate laughed, startled by it, and it cracked something open in both of them. The boys keep asking when you'll get here, she said. They think you're bringing snacks. I'll bring snacks and board games and probably a deeply avoidant coping style, but I'm working on that. Well, take it, she whispered. All of it. A long silence settled, warm and steady. For the first time in a long time, there was no running, no hiding, just two people, thousands of miles apart, building a bridge with each word. You're really coming, she said almost to herself. I'm really coming. Yet despite the profound solace he found in their calls, a quiet ache persisted. He was falling more deeply in love with Kate, a love born of understanding and shared vulnerabilities. But the unspoken truth of the velvet mask felt like a barrier, a heavy secret that prevented him from offering her his whole self. He was still River Hayes, the man haunted by too many ghosts, and the fear of his own exposure, the fear of losing the fragile bridge he'd built with Kate, kept his most profound truth locked away. It was a distant comfort, a profound connection, yet always shadowed by the threat of everything breaking down. The days bled into weeks, a relentless cycle of hospital shifts, guarded conversations with Kate, and the simmering anxiety of the velvet mask's escalating fame. River was a man perpetually on edge, his senses heightened, constantly aware of his surroundings, always scanning for potential threats to his carefully constructed anonymity. He was in Los Angeles, a city of millions, yet he felt profoundly exposed. He had long since blocked Ireland's number and email, attempting to sever all ties with the venomous presence that had so effectively poisoned his brief Christmas in California and his three-way call with Kate. He wanted her out of his life, permanently, but Ireland, like a persistent noxious weed, found ways to linger to remind him of her watchful, malicious presence. It started subtly, a mutual acquaintance, someone from Lakin's social circle, whom River rarely saw, would casually mention Ireland. Oh, Ireland was asking about you the other day, River, they'd say, their tone innocent, oblivious to the chill that sent down his spine. Said she hoped you were doing better after everything. Seems concerned. River would force a polite smile, mumbling a non-committal reply, his mind racing. Ireland was subtly probing, gathering information, keeping tabs. Then came the more direct, unsettling intrusions. He'd find comments on articles about the Velvet Mask, not on his official channels, which were meticulously guarded, but on speculative fan blogs or music forums, comments signed by anonymous users, but with a specific turn of phrase or a subtle reference that screamed Ireland. They weren't direct threats, but veiled hints, insidious whispers designed to make him paranoid. It's always the quiet ones, isn't it? The ones who hide the most are usually hiding the biggest secrets, or such deep emotion this mask. One wonders what profound personal trauma fuels such. Perhaps a very private, very messy divorce? River would read them, his blood running cold, knowing she was out there watching, waiting. He began to feel her presence even when she wasn't physically near. A flicker of movement at the edge of his vision, a car that seemed to follow him for a block too long, a sense of being observed as he left his apartment building. He dismissed it as paranoia, the product of his exhaustion and stress, but the fear was real. He felt a profound sense of violation of his meager privacy being stripped away piece by piece. Ireland was playing a long game, a cruel, calculated game of psychological warfare, proving that even across miles her reach was long, and her malice unwavering. He knew she watched his life, waited for a weakness, for an opportunity to strike, and that knowledge was a suffocating blanket of dread. The apartment always felt emptier when River returned from a long shift, the silence amplifying his gnawing loneliness. Tonight, however, the quiet was broken by an unexpected presence. On his polished entryway table, where only junk mail usually accumulated, sat a small, elegantly wrapped gift. It was a simple, unassuming package, tied with a silver ribbon. No card, no return address. River stopped dead, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten, replaced by a surge of cold dread. He hadn't ordered anything. No one he knew would send him a gift without a card, without warning. His mind immediately went to Ireland. The thought sent a chill through him, the hairs on his arms rising. He approached the package cautiously, as if it might bite. The wrapping paper was a subtle, metallic silver, expensive and understated. He picked it up, his fingers brushing against the smooth, cool paper. It felt light and substantial. He shook it gently. No telltale rattle of glass or ceramics. Slowly, carefully, he peeled back the tape, his gaze darting around the silent apartment, a deep-seated paranoia prickling his skin. What was she planning? What new torment had she devised? He carefully untied the ribbon and unfolded the paper. Inside lay a single item, nestled in a bed of tissue paper, a small, exquisitely carved wooden mask. It was intricately detailed, made of dark polished wood, its surface smooth and cool to the touch. The eyes were hollow, empty, staring into nothingness. It was beautiful, haunting, and utterly terrifying. It wasn't his velvet mask, it was different, more archaic, but the symbolism was unmistakable. It was a clear, chilling message. I know, I see you, I see your mask. River dropped the mask onto the table as if it had burned him. It clattered softly, the sound amplified in the profound silence of the apartment. His hands were trembling, his breath shallow. This wasn't a casual gift. This was a deliberate, malevolent message. It was Ireland reminding him that she was watching, that she knew his secret, that she could reach him, even in his own home. She was telling him that the velvet mask was not as anonymous as he believed, that his carefully guarded identity was compromised. He ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. How? How had she found out? Had she always known? Had his careless mumbling that night at Christmas truly revealed so much? Or had she somehow pieced it together from subtle clues, from his reclusiveness, from his music, perhaps even from Lakin? The thought that Lakin might have unwittingly given her clues, or that Ireland had actively sought to expose him, sent a fresh wave of nausea through him. He felt utterly exposed, violated. His apartment, once a retreat, now felt like a glass house, every movement visible, every secret vulnerable. The privacy he so desperately clung to was dissolving piece by agonizing piece. The wooden mask sat on his table, its empty eyes mocking his facade, a chilling symbol of Ireland's power. His escalating fear, the wooden mask, sat on River's entryway table for days, a constant, chilling reminder of Ireland's insidious. He couldn't bring himself to touch it or throw it away. Its empty eyes seemed to follow him, mocking his attempts at anonymity, whispering threats of exposure. The paranoia intensified, bleeding into every aspect of his life. He was a prisoner in his own home, constantly checking locks, peering through curtains, jumping at shadows. Sleep became an even rarer luxury, punctuated by nightmares of relentless pursuits and public unmaskings. The stress manifested physically. The tremor in his hands was no longer subtle. It was noticeable, a persistent shake that made intricate surgical tasks at the hospital a terrifying challenge. He found himself compensating, overthinking every movement, his focus fractured by anxiety. His exhaustion was bone deep, a constant crushing weight that pressed down on his chest. He knew with a horrifying clarity what he had to do. The music, the velvet mask, was his passion, his soul, his escape, but it was also the conduit, the very thing that was attracting the relentless hunt, the thing that gave Ireland the leverage to torment him. His contract with Elias Vance was a golden handcuff, binding him to a fame that threatened to destroy him. He retreated to his studio, the familiar space now feeling alien, oppressive. The platinum plaques on the walls, symbols of his unprecedented success, seemed to mock his despair. He picked up his guitar, but his fingers felt heavy, unresponsive. The melodies that usually poured out of him, raw and cathartic, were stifled by a suffocating fear. He couldn't write. He couldn't sing. The muse had abandoned him, consumed by the shadow of exposure. He remembered the early days of the Velvet Mask, the pure joy of creation, the freedom anonymity provided. He thought of Kate, of how she had praised his music, how she had connected with his art, unaware of the man behind the mask. He loved her more fiercely than ever, and the thought of her being hurt, her being exposed to the ugliness of his life, pushed him to the agonizing decision. He had to stop. He called Elias Vance, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, betraying nothing of the internal turmoil. Elias, Rivers stated, his voice calm, resolute. I'm stopping, effective immediately. No new music, no new visualizers, no more appearances, virtual or otherwise. The velvet mask is going dark. There was a stunned silence on the other end, then Elias's voice rising in a furious crescendo. What are you talking about, Mr. Hayes? Are you insane? You're at the peak of your career. You're a global phenomenon. Marcus Thorne is planning a world tour, an unmasked reveal for him, but a massive segment for you. Do you have any idea what we're talking about? The contracts? The breaches? I understand the contracts, Elias. River cut him off, his voice unwavering. And I understand the penalties. I'm prepared to face them. I will pay whatever is owed. But I can't do this anymore. The pressure, it's too much. My privacy is being violated. My identity is being hunted. My family is being threatened. He didn't mention Ireland specifically or the wooden mask, but the unspoken truth hung in the air. Threatened? Van scoffed, disbelief in his voice. By what? Conspiracy theorists? Overzealous fans? This is the price of fame, Mr. Hayes. You agreed to this. I agreed to anonymity, Elias, River retorted, his voice rising, a flash of his suppressed anger. Not a constant hunt. Not a perpetual invasion. My private life is compromised. My very safety is at risk. I have to protect myself and my family. He thought of Adam, alone in Belgium, grieving Vera. He thought of the constant fear his biological family represented. This was the only way. The painful, agonizing, necessary way. You're making a catastrophic mistake, River, Vance roared, his voice filled with a mixture of fury and genuine disbelief. You're throwing away everything. A legacy. I'm choosing survival, Elias, River said, his voice quiet, final. And I'm choosing peace. This conversation is over. My lawyer will be in touch. He hung up, cutting off Vance's enraged protests, silence in the studio heavy, suffocating. He had cut the cord. He had chosen to silence his muse, to abandon the very thing that made him feel alive, believing it was the only way to safeguard what little he had left. The studio, once a sanctuary, was now a tomb for his creative soul, testament to the crushing weight of fame and fear. He felt utterly empty, but also, paradoxically, a strange, hollow sense of peace. He had done what he believed was necessary. The silence in River's studio after he hung up on Elias Vance was deafening, a profound void that swallowed all sound, all hope. He stood amidst the platinum plaques and state-of-the-art equipment, feeling utterly, terrifyingly empty. He had chosen silence. He had chosen to retreat. He had chosen, he believed, survival. But the cost was immense. The music, his soul, his escape, the very thing that made him feel alive was now dormant, silenced by fear. He sank onto the worn studio couch, his hands running through his hair, gripping it tightly. The weight of his decision, the sheer magnitude of what he had discarded, pressed him. A global phenomenon, a collaboration with Marcus Thorne, fortune, all sacrificed for the desperate hope of regaining a semblance of peace, of protecting his shattered privacy. He had burnt his bridge. The phone rang again, an insistent, angry buzz against the quiet. It was Elias Vance, undoubtedly calling back, his fury unchecked. River let it go to voicemail, then silenced his phone, plunging himself into a deeper, isolated quiet. He knew the legal ramifications would be immense. Breach of contract, millions in penalties. But he would face it. He had to. There was no other choice. His days, already a brutal grind of hospital shifts and study, now felt even more desolate. He had lost his creative outlet, the cathartic release that had sustained him through Vera's death, through the Lakin divorce, through the constant gnawing of his unworthiness. The studio, once his sanctuary, became a place he avoided, its silence mocking his choice. He tried to study, but his mind rebelled. Complex medical terms blurred before his eyes, and he tried to sleep, but the nightmares, always lurking, intensified. He saw faces, a terrifying amalgam of Regan's cold eyes, Ralph's sneer, Lakin's calculating smile, all merging with the relentless flash of phantom cameras, the roar of an invisible crowd. He woke in a cold sweat, his body trembling, the phantom aches in his bones, a constant reminder of the wreck, of his past addiction, of the physical manifestation of his internal turmoil. He felt a profound sense of despair, a quiet hopelessness that seeped into every cell of his being. He had traded one cage for another, perhaps even smaller, even more suffocating. He thought of Kate. Their late night calls had been a lifeline. He longed to tell her what he had done, to explain the agonizing decision to silence his music, the driving fear of exposure, the overwhelming need to protect his privacy. He wanted to confess the irony that the faceless artist she admired was him, the one who loved her. But the very decision to stop the music made out of fear had also created a new barrier between them. How could he explain this monumental sacrifice, this retreat, without confirming all of Ireland's poisonous narratives about his instability, his tendency to run, his ultimate fear of commitment? He still felt so utterly unworthy of her love, her beautiful, full life. The silence he had chosen was a desperate plea for peace, but it was also a deepening isolation. He was truly alone, adrift in a sea of his own making, his greatest talent, his deepest passion, silenced by fear. The silence in Rivers' studio was a heavy, suffocating blanket, pressing in on him, amplifying the profound emptiness that now permeated his days. He had done it. He had chosen silence. He had chosen to retreat. He had chosen, he believed, survival. But the cost was immense. The velvet mask, his soul, his escape, the very thing that made him feel alive, was now dormant, silenced by a fear that felt more real than any physical threat. He rarely went into the studio now. The platinum plaques on the walls, symbols of his global success, seemed to mock his despair, gleaming with a fame he couldn't publicly claim, a triumph he couldn't truly celebrate. The thought of picking up his guitar, of pouring his raw emotion into a new song, felt like a betrayal of his desperate gamble for peace. Every creative impulse was stifled by the cold dread of exposure, by the nagging fear that his very expression was a vulnerability. He was a ghost haunting his own life. The relentless grind of hospital shifts continued, but without the cathartic release of music, the days felt longer, heavier. He performed his duties mechanically, his mind often adrift in a sea of his own making. He'd find himself staring blankly at patient charts, the complex medical terminology blurring before his eyes, his focus fractured by anxiety. The nights were worse. Sleep was an elusive luxury, a cruel trick that offered no respite. He would lie in bed rigid, listening to the hum of the air conditioner, his mind a battlefield of fragmented memories. The nightmares intensified. A terrifying maelstrom of faces, Reagan's cold eyes, Ralph's sneering jealousy, Lakin, his calculating smile, all merging with the relentless flash of phantom cameras, the roar of an invisible, demanding crowd. He woke in a cold sweat, his body trembling, the familiar ache in his bones, a constant reminder of the wreck, of his past addiction, the physical manifestation of his internal turmoil. He felt a profound sense of despair, a quiet hopelessness that seeped into every cell of his being. He had traded one cage for another, perhaps even smaller, even more suffocating. The fear of being found was still a relentless hunter, intensified by the forced inactivity of the velvet mask. He was losing himself, piece by agonizing piece, in the silence. He was a man with too many secrets, and the burden was crushing him. The days dragged on, each an exercise in endurance. River's body felt like a lead weight, dragged through the motions of his internship. The constant physical ache, a dull thrum beneath his skin, was a grim reminder of the wreck, not just the immediate injuries, but the lingering consequence of years of neglected health, of his body protesting the abuse it had endured during his addiction. He pushed himself with grim determination, forcing his mind to focus on complex medical problems, to interpret lab results, to assist in surgeries. But the energy was dwindling, replaced by a pervasive weariness that seeped into his very bones. His mental state was even more precarious. The nightmares were now a nightly torment, vivid and relentless. He would see himself exposed, stripped bare, standing helpless before a jeering crowd, the faces of his biological family leering from the shadows, the phantom tremor in his hands, once subtle, now manifested visibly when he was alone, a disturbing vibration that spoke of nerves frayed raw, of a control he was rapidly losing. He saw it when he tried to hold a coffee cup, when he signed a chart, when he reached for his phone. It was a terrifying regression, a stark reminder of his past battle with substance abuse, a constant whisper of the darkness he fought so hard to leave behind. His routine was a monotonous loop of hospital, apartment, and the occasional strained conversation with Adam in Belgium. He pushed friends away, unable to articulate the depth of his despair, the suffocating fear that gripped him. He rarely went to Charlie's anymore. The risk too high, the joy too fleeting. He felt like a solitary island lashed by unseen storms, utterly alone. He yearned for the solace of Kate's voice, their late night calls, but the sheer weight of his silence, the secret he still couldn't tell her about the velvet mask, felt like an insurmountable barrier. He was terrified of burdening her further, of her seeing him as truly broken, confirming his deepest fear of unworthiness. He knew he was barely holding on. The thought of Lakin, of her insidious presence in his life, of the still pending divorce, was another layer of suffocating pressure. He was fighting a war on multiple fronts: his past, his present, his precarious future, and the relentless pursuit of an anonymity that felt increasingly impossible to maintain. He was living under a phantom weight, the unseen burden of his shattered life pressing him down, pushing him closer and closer to the edge. The apartment felt like a pressure cooker, the air thick with unspoken hostility, despite River's continued efforts to avoid Lakin. The divorce proceedings, while moving forward, were a slow, agonizing grind. Lakin, ever the performer, seemed to relish the opportunity to inflict further pain, to assert her control over their fractured narrative. She had heard the whispers, of course, the news of the velvet mask going dark, of his sudden withdrawal from the public eye, had undoubtedly reached her through her vast network of social connections, perhaps even directly from Ireland, who seemed to delight in delivering any tidbit that could wound River. She saw his retreat not as a desperate act of self-preservation, but as a failure, a sign of weakness, a failure to capitalize on the very asset she had hoped to exploit. Her contempt for him deepened, becoming almost palpable. She no longer bothered with the veneer of sympathy or feigned concern. Her disdain was sharp, cutting, delivered with chilling precision. Hospital's fluorescent lights hummed, casting a sterile, unrelenting glow over River's face. He was in the middle of a complex case in the ER, a chaotic symphony of beeping machines, shouted commands, and the raw urgency of a life in the balance. His focus was absolute, his medical training taking over, pushing aside the gnawing despair of his personal life. He was a doctor here, an aspiring healer, and in this environment he found a temporary reprieve from his internal torment. He pulled his phone from his pocket, quickly checking a medical reference app, then slipped it back in. He noticed nothing amiss. The device felt as familiar as his own hand, a constant extension of his life. Later that evening, after a particularly grueling shift, River dragged himself back to his apartment. Silence hit him first, cold and heavy. He tossed his keys onto the entry table, kicked off his shoes, and headed straight for the kitchen, desperate for food, for anything to fill the void. He pulled his phone from his pocket, intending to check his email, to see if Kate had replied to his last message. He unlocked the screen, his thumb brushing the familiar icons, and then he froze. Something was wrong. His music app, the one he used for the Velvet Mask recordings, was open. Not just open, but displaying a screen he didn't recognize. He scrolled instinctively through his recent photos, and his breath hitched. Private photos. Photos he had taken for his own reference, photos of his medical textbooks, photos of his studio setup, even a blurry selfie he'd accidentally taken with James months ago. They were all there, exposed, not in his private camera roll, but in the app's public-facing interface, accessible. Then he saw it. A new post, not one he had authorized, not one he had even drafted. It was on the Velvet Mask official social media account, the one he had meticulously guarded, the one Elias Vance's team managed under strict protocol. His heart hammered against his ribs, a cold dread washing over him. He clicked the post, and his world shattered. The image was a distorted, grainy picture of him, taken surreptitiously, likely through a window, showing him in his apartment, unmasked, exhausted, hunched over his studio desk, his face grim. It was unmistakably River Hayes. The accompanying caption was a venomous, fabricated narrative, dripping with malice. "This is your mysterious velvet mask? Not so mysterious when you see the real him, is it? Behind the fancy music and the fake persona is a broken man, a drug addict who can't hold his life together. He ran from his problems, abandoned his responsibilities, and treated his wife like dirt. This artist is a fraud, a liar, a manipulator. He hides his face because he's ashamed of the monster he is. And now, he's crumbling, mentally unstable. Don't believe the hype. Don't believe the act. He's a mess. And he's about to explode." Below the image, a string of hashtags calculated to cause maximum damage. Hashtag unmask the velvet mask. Hashtag broken artist. Hashtag fraud. Hashtag addict. Hashtag mental breakdown. Hashtag liar. Hashtag behind a mask. River stared at the screen, his hands trembling violently. The betrayal was absolute. His privacy, his anonymity, his carefully constructed life, all of it had been utterly violated. His hands, already trembling, began to shake violently. He dropped the phone onto the counter, the screen still glowing with the horrifying image, the damning words. No, this wasn't happening. This couldn't be real. But it was. It was the Velvet Mask official account. His account. He hadn't posted this, he hadn't authorized this. Ireland. The name, a cold, hard stone, dropped into the pit of his stomach. Only Ireland. Only she knew enough. Only she possessed the kind of calculated cruelty, the venomous intent to orchestrate such a devastating public annihilation. She had found a way. She had stolen his phone, gained access, invaded his most private digital space, and unleashed his deepest fears onto the world. A wave of profound nausea washed over him, bile rising in his throat. This wasn't just an unmasking, it was a character assassination, a deliberate act of complete destruction. She wasn't simply revealing his identity, she was twisting it, fabricating a narrative of mental instability, resurrecting the ghosts of his past addiction, painting him as a fraud, a monster. His privacy, his anonymity, his carefully constructed life, all of it had been utterly violated. His deepest fear, his most profound vulnerability, his fundamental unworthiness, laid bare for public consumption, confirmed by the very person who delighted in his misery. He stumbled back, his legs weak, till he hit the kitchen island, the smooth, cool quartz, the same surface where Lakin and Ralph had desecrated his home, now felt like a symbol of his utter powerlessness. His private world, his final sanctuary, had been shattered by the malice of a woman he had once mistakenly called a friend. The world was about to explode, and he was standing right in the middle of the detonation, utterly exposed, utterly helpless. He felt a profound, chilling sense of defeat, a cold understanding that he had lost. The detonation was swift, brutal, and deafening. River barely registered the initial shock of discovering the post before his phone, still lying face up on the counter, began to scream. It buzzed, vibrated, rang incessantly, a relentless assault of notifications and incoming calls. Elias Vance's name flashed across the screen repeatedly, followed by a flurry of unknown numbers. Then calls from news agencies, major music publications, even his own lawyer. He watched, paralyzed, as the digital world, once his anonymous canvas, erupted into a blinding storm. Social media feeds, which had been buzzing with speculation about the Velvet Mask's silence, now screamed with outrage, confusion, and a perverse fascination. Hashtag Unmask the Velvet Mask was trending globally, but now it was accompanied by hashtag Velvet Mask Fraud, hashtag Addict Revealed, hashtag Broken Artist. The comment section beneath the malicious post was a torrential flood of condemnation, disbelief, and a chilling voyeurism. I can't believe it. He's a fraud? Always knew there was something off about him. What a shame. Another tortured artist turns out to be a junkie. He hid his face for a reason. What a liar. News alerts flashed across his laptop screen, headlines screaming his name, his hidden identity, his past struggles. Velvet Mask unmasked. Shocking details revealed about anonymous singer's secret life. Addiction, divorce, and alleged mental breakdown plague pop sensation. The Velvet Mask, fraud or victim. The carefully constructed image, the mystique, the artistry he had painstakingly built was being ripped apart, shredded into salacious headlines and venomous speculation. Rivers stumbled back, his legs giving out, sinking to the cold kitchen floor. He pressed his hands over his ears, trying to shut out the relentless noise, the digital cacophony that had invaded his once private home. His head pounded, a blinding migraine blossoming behind his eyes. He felt a profound sense of disorientation, a terrifying unreality. This couldn't be happening.